The Silent Woman. Lynn's day started before dawn, like it always did. Wrapped in a heavy coat, she braved the biting New York wind as she hurried along the bustling streets, a steaming cup of coffee her only comfort. It was just past 7 when she arrived at the glass-fronted headquarters of Aurora Realty, a prestigious real estate company known for its cutthroat pace and dazzling ambitions. Even at this early hour, the lobby buzzed with energy. Lynn moved quietly through the crowd, greeting the familiar faces of the security staff and the janitor with a polite smile before disappearing into the elevator. Unlike her colleagues, Lynn never sought the spotlight. She dressed simply, blending into the sea of professionals that filled the office each day. Yet beneath her understated appearance was a mind always alert, precise, and creative. As she settled into her desk by the window, a spot she'd quietly claimed for its view of the city, she methodically reviewed her emails, updated her to-do list, and mapped out her day. Her role at Aurora Realty was rarely credited in the company's monthly spotlights, but Lynn had become indispensable through her perseverance and attention to detail. She handled everything from negotiating with difficult clients to troubleshooting project crises and smoothing over misunderstandings between teams. When others faltered, she stepped in with calm efficiency, rarely asking for recognition, never complaining about overtime or last-minute changes. Her presence was steady, reassuring, like a foundation stone few people ever noticed unless it was gone. Still, Lynn's unassuming manner hid a fierce drive. She had left her home country 6 years ago, determined to make a life for herself in America. Every late night and every missed family gathering had shaped her quiet resilience. At Aurora, she kept her personal life private, sharing little more than a gentle smile and the occasional "good morning." The only person she'd once trusted deeply had been Lon, the woman who was now both her direct manager and, perhaps more painfully, her former closest friend. Their friendship had begun with laughter and late-night strategy sessions, two immigrants supporting each other's ambitions in a foreign city. Over time, and as Lon climbed the company ranks, subtle shifts in their relationship began to appear. In the present, the office dynamic was charged with invisible tensions. Lynn sometimes wondered if anyone else sensed how the atmosphere changed whenever Lon entered the room. The way conversations paused, the wary glances exchanged among colleagues. For Lynn, the pressure was constant but quietly applied. A heavy hand that never left bruises but pressed her to work harder, deliver more, and ask for less in return. Throughout the day, Lynn moved through the routines of her job, preparing presentations, answering urgent requests from clients, and reviewing stacks of paperwork for accuracy. She worked late, making corrections others had overlooked, ensuring that the company's projects ran seamlessly. Her co-workers often took her reliability for granted, assuming she preferred the background. But beneath Lynn's calm exterior, questions brewed. She sometimes caught her own reflection in the darkened office windows at night, searching for answers in tired eyes. Did her contributions matter? Was anyone truly watching? For now, she told herself, it was enough to be useful, enough to be needed. Even if her presence went unacknowledged, Lynn believed that honesty and diligence would eventually lead her somewhere better. Unbeknownst to everyone around her, she was a silent force, one destined, in time, to make herself heard. Stolen credit. The first hints of spring were arriving in New York, and with them came the company's annual push for new projects and bold ideas. This year, Aurora Realty's executive board had called for a transformative initiative to regain its edge in the fiercely competitive market. It was the kind of high-stakes challenge that set the entire office abuzz, and one that Lynn had thrown herself into with her usual quiet fervor. For weeks, Lynn worked long into the evenings, poring over data, surveying market trends and thinking creatively about how to position Aurora as a leader. She filled notebooks with ideas, sketched out potential strategies, and crafted detailed proposals. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. This was the kind of challenge she thrived on. Once she was confident her plan was solid, Lynn shared her progress with Lan. As her manager and former friend, Lan was the obvious person to turn to. Sitting across from Lan in her glass-walled office, Lynn presented her comprehensive strategy, complete with supporting research and a carefully constructed presentation deck. Lan listened intently, nodding and jotting down notes, appearing genuinely impressed. "Honestly, Lynn, this could be a real game-changer for us," Lan remarked, her tone warm. "Let me take some time to digest it fully, and then we'll see about bringing it up with the board." Lynn left the meeting with a rare sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her efforts would finally be recognized. Over the next few days, Lynn waited in anxious anticipation, refining her presentation and practicing answers to possible questions. She noticed Lan spending extra hours holed up in meetings with senior executives. The buzz around the office grew, punctuated by snippets of conversation about a fresh, daring pitch that was about to shake things up. The day of the presentation, Lynn arrived early, heart pounding in her chest. As she sat sorting through her notes, an administrative assistant handed her a memo. The agenda listed Project Skyline, Strategic Proposal, presented by Lan Nguyen. Lynn's name was nowhere in sight. Confused and uneasy, she entered the boardroom and took a chair at the side, as she usually did. The room, filled with directors and department heads, the air thick with anticipation. When the meeting began, Lan stood at the front, confidence radiating from her. Without so much as a glance at Lynn, she launched into the presentation. Line by line, slide by slide, it was Lynn's plan. The same graphics Lynn spent hours perfecting. Her words, her research, her vision, forged and delivered as if they were Lan's own. Lynn sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her notepad, a sense of betrayal tightening her chest. Applause erupted as Lan finished. The CEO singled her out for praise, commending her initiative and insight. Directors offered congratulatory handshakes. Lan accepted it all with polished composure, smoothly thanking the team for their support, but never mentioning Lynn's name. Afterward, Lynn remained seated as others filed out, the humiliation burning deep and silent. One coworker patted her shoulder, offering a sympathetic half-smile. "Tough break," he murmured, not meeting her eyes. Alone at her desk that night, Lynn tried to make sense of it. Doubt gnawed at her. Maybe she was expecting too much. Maybe this was just how things worked in big companies. Still, a small voice grew louder within her. She remembered the effort, the sleepless nights, the thrill of creation. The sting of having it all stripped away left its mark. In the days that followed, Lynn noticed subtle shifts in how colleagues treated her. Dismissive nods, overlooked suggestions, the assumption that her role was always supportive, never leading. It became clear. When recognition was on the line, her efforts were invisible. Lan, meanwhile, was lauded for her bold leadership, earning new responsibilities and further cementing her authority. Despite her disappointment, Lynn buried her anger and kept her head down, determined to hold on to her job. But what had once been a close friendship with Lan now felt irretrievably changed, replaced by a chilling awareness. Her hard work had made someone else's name, while she herself had faded further into the background. And though she said nothing aloud, a resolve began to form beneath Lynn's disappointment. She would not let this injustice define her, no matter how silent she had been before. Days of suppression. The aftermath of the stolen idea hung over Lynn's world like a perpetual gray cloud. In the once bright and bustling office, Lynn's presence seemed to shrink even further, as if she were trying to disappear inside a maze of spreadsheets, project plans, and polite silences. Where her voice had once quietly contributed to the team's success, now it was often met with indifference, sometimes even dismissed outright. Lan's attitude toward Lin changed almost overnight. No longer soft-spoken or encouraging in private, Lan had adopted a veneer of icy professionalism, directing Lin's every move with clipped instructions and impossible deadlines. Every morning brought a new string of tasks, stacked one atop the other with no end in sight. "Take care of these before noon," Lan would say, dropping a thick file on Lin's desk moments before a department meeting. Lunch breaks vanished, replaced by urgent client requests and hastily rewritten reports. The pressure was relentless, pressing in on Lin from all sides. Small tasks Lin had once handled meticulously now ballooned into thankless chores. If a deal faltered, if a client complained, if a number didn't reconcile, the blame was quietly routed to Lin, sometimes in emails she wasn't even copied on. Meanwhile, any successes were attributed to team effort, with Lan positioned squarely at the head. Coworkers who used to chat with Lin at the coffee machine kept their distance now, a side effect, perhaps, of Lan's thinly veiled warnings. Wordlessly, a wall formed between Lin and the rest of the office. Whenever Lin attempted to speak up, Lan deftly cut her off, sometimes with a thin smile, sometimes with a look sharp enough to freeze a room. "Let's focus on results, not excuses," Lan would reply if Lin hinted at being overstretched. A single suggestion from Lin in a meeting was quickly redirected or outright ignored, only to resurface later as Lan's own insight. The relentless cycle wore on Lin, eroding her confidence. She began to second-guess her every move, hesitating before offering ideas or asking questions, afraid of further retaliation. Privately, Lin struggled with a growing sense of alienation, not just from her colleagues, but from her old self. She remembered when her relationship with Lan was defined by trust and warmth, a partnership that made both women stronger. Now, Lin could barely look at her former friend without feeling the sting of betrayal and the weight of disappointment. Each day seemed to chip away at those memories, replacing them with fresh wounds. The emotional toll was undeniable. Sleep became elusive, her nights haunted by worry and self-doubt. Even away from work, Lin found herself rehearsing explanations and apologies, desperate for a way to reclaim her former standing. Letters from her parents went unanswered. Invitations from friends were ignored. She lived in a state of constant anxiety, her mind occupied by how to survive the next day, the next project, the next encounter with Lan. Despite the mounting pressure, Lin held on, determined not to give her tormentor the satisfaction of seeing her break. She focused on her work, pushing herself harder, believing, perhaps naively, that if she continued to deliver, things would eventually improve. But the company had become a battlefield, each day an exercise in endurance and restraint. Under the cold, fluorescent lights, Lin's world was growing ever smaller, her voice lost amidst the clatter of keys and the quiet efficiency of someone desperately trying not to fall apart. Still, beneath the layers of frustration and hurt, Lin's sense of justice simmered. She watched, quietly cataloging every slight, every unreasonable demand. Every moment her value was dismissed or erased. If the world around her only saw a silent woman, they were wrong. Inside, a storm was gathering, and though she didn't yet know how or when she would fight back, Lin vowed that these days of suppression would not last forever. The breaking point. Calamity strikes. Spring in New York painted the city with hopeful hues. Flowering trees across avenues, golden sunlight brushing glass towers, and parks swelling with life. Yet for Lin, the season marked a time of mounting dread. In the span of just a few weeks, the grinding stress of work had shifted from being a heavy burden to what felt like an ongoing ambush. Everything in the office now seemed designed to press her to the edge. It started innocuously enough. Lon, ever the poised manager, summoned Lynn into her office early one Monday morning. The glass wall, once symbolic of Lan's transparency, now felt more like a showcase where Lynn's every move would be scrutinized. Lan slid a thick folder across the table, her fingers tapping it in a gesture that brooked no discussion. "I'll need you to handle this account personally," Lan said, her voice smooth but empty of warmth. "The client is sensitive and expects flawless communication. I'm attaching high expectations to this, Lynn. Don't disappoint me." Lynn nodded, hiding her unease behind a practiced, tight-lipped smile. She spent the day poring over the account details, a luxury development project recently acquired by Aurora Realty, loaded with logistical complexity and a notoriously demanding client. Even on a good day, this would have been a challenge. Now, weighted with exhaustion and self-doubt, Lynn could already sense the storm brewing. The days blurred into an impossible cycle of 12-hour work shifts peppered with tense meetings, frantic phone calls, and mounting pressure. At every stage, Lan seemed to hover behind her, observing, critiquing, picking apart the minutiae of Lynn's progress. Small mistakes, the sort any team would expect during the early phases of a new project, were seized upon by Lan and magnified before the team. In staff meetings, Lan's voice dripped with barely concealed impatience. "I don't want excuses, only solutions," she snapped when Lynn pointed out gaps in the client's information that were stalling progress. "You're supposed to be resourceful. I need you to be better, Lynn." Colleagues who'd once smiled at Lynn in quiet solidarity now looked away as she passed by. Even the tiny gestures of camaraderie, the shared laughter over coffee, the whispered encouragements in the hallway, had faded. Lan's influence had grown pervasive. Rumors quietly circulated. Lynn, perhaps, was slipping. Lynn was overwhelmed. Maybe she was out of her depth. The truth was less dramatic but more heartbreaking. She was being set up to fail. The first blow landed on a Thursday afternoon. The difficult client, irritated by the unavoidable delays and miscommunications, several of which stemmed from absent details that Lan herself had not provided, exploded in a scathing email to Aurora's executive board. Lan wasted no time in forwarding the message to HR, CCing the entire senior management with a terse summary attached. "Lynn's inability to meet client standards is threatening this account. Immediate action is advised." Lynn's heart plummeted as she read the exchange, the words blurring before her tired eyes. Despite her best efforts, every shortcoming had been meticulously documented, every falter weaponized against her. She tried to defend herself, compiling a timeline of communication and flagged issues. The unanswered emails, the missing documents, the calls that never reached her desk. But when she presented them to Lan, her plea was swiftly and coldly dismissed. "I gave you everything you needed," Lan said, not bothering to conceal her irritation. "If there were problems, you should have alerted me sooner. As it stands, this is your responsibility. There's a limit to how much I can cover for you." Lynn could feel the carefully built foundation of her reputation eroding, the years of reliability and dedication dissolving like chalk in the rain. Now, her every move seemed monitored. Reports she submitted came back marked with patronizing notes, her inbox filled with urgent requests and reminders that left her scrambling to keep up with her mounting workload. Then, at the weekly all-hands meeting, the situation reached its tragic peak. Lan, exuding calm authority, made an announcement that cast a shadow over Lynn's career. "We've identified serious discrepancies in client management and project deliverables," Lan announced, scanning the room. "Unfortunately, these failures have impacted our clients' trust. We will be reviewing our internal processes and making changes where necessary." Though Lon never directly named Lynn, everyone in the room understood who was responsible. The glance colleagues shot her way was a knife of pity, or perhaps silent relief that it wasn't them in her place. The message was clear. Lynn had failed. The once invisible woman was now glaringly visible, but only as the bearer of blame. In the days that followed, Lynn's isolation deepened, carving a hollow inside her. HR scheduled a performance review meeting. The implication was obvious. Her job now hung by a thread. Despite her years of dedication, it all appeared to amount to nothing. Lynn's calls home grew shorter, her conversations with friends stilted and rare. She wandered the city after work in a daze, watching life bustle around her with a sense that she stood on the other side of a glass wall. She considered, more than once, whether it was time to give up, pack her things and leave, severing the dream that had brought her to America in the first place. Yet, in her darkest moments, Lynn could not shake the deep current of injustice that ran beneath it all. She replayed in her mind the subtle manipulations, the missing documentation, the calculated indifference in Lan's eyes. For the first time, despair mingled with a hardened resolve. She knew now that she was not just unlucky or incompetent. She was being destroyed, methodically. One night, unable to sleep, Lynn sat by her kitchen window, gazing out at the city's endless lights. She wondered how many others like her sat in silence, swallowing unfairness, their stories untold. Was this what survival looked like? Or was it just a slow surrender? As dawn crept toward the horizon, Lynn made a silent promise to herself. If there was no path forward for her in this company, she would at least make sure the truth was known. She would reclaim her story, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or forced to bear the burden of someone else's ambition. The calamity that had erupted in her life was not just an ending, she realized, but possibly the beginning of something else, a chance to turn a chapter defined by oppression into one shaped by courage. And as the city gradually brightened with morning light, so too did the first fragile spark of her determination. Exploitation and resistance. Lynn's world had become a warped reflection of everything she once believed about hard work, loyalty, and justice. If the previous weeks had taught her anything, it was that endurance by itself would never be enough. She had already tried patience and silence, and those virtues had delivered nothing but betrayal, exhaustion, and a career nearly torn to pieces. She spent that first weekend after her performance review in a haze, curled up on her couch with the city's sirens and horns echoing in the distance. At first, she let herself wallow in a maelstrom of shame and regret. She reviewed every tiny mistake and misstep, every moment she'd bitten her tongue instead of speaking up. Was she naive to have trusted Lan for so long, or to have believed that good work could shield her from the casual cruelties of office politics? But as Sunday afternoon faded into evening, Lynn's emotions began to shift. The old fear lingered, but a new, steely resolve set in. She found herself replaying every slight, every task dumped on her desk, every email where her name was omitted and Lan's was highlighted. She remembered the sting of humiliation, but more than that, she remembered her worth. She was not powerless, she told herself. She simply needed to stop playing by rules that others bent and broke without hesitation. If Aurora Realty wanted evidence, well, she would give it to them. And this time, she'd protect herself before another blow could fall. A calculated shift. On Monday morning, Lynn entered the office with her usual calm, but beneath her quiet exterior, she was in constant calculation. She was meticulous with her work, double and triple checking every detail so that if another accusation came, she'd have an airtight record. The files for her projects were now organized not just in the company's system, but in her own encrypted backups. She started forwarding important client emails to her personal address, attaching timestamps and project versions, each piece a brick in a wall of truth no one could easily knock down. Every meeting became an opportunity to gather evidence. Lynn toggled discreetly between her notes and the recording app on her phone, saving snippets of crucial conversations, never violating confidentiality, but capturing enough to establish context. If Lan assigned her a task without a written brief, Lynn would immediately send a follow-up email summarizing their conversation and politely requesting confirmation. Each time, she kept her tone unfailingly professional, never giving Lan an excuse to accuse her of insubordination. She paid attention to every dismissal, every public reprimand. She documented every instance where Lan claimed credit for Lynn's work, adding screen captures to a growing dossier. Lynn was quietly, systematically building a case, not just for herself, but for the truth that the company so often claimed to prize. Quiet connections. For the first time, Lynn also allowed herself to look up from her desk and really see the people around her. In months past, she'd withdrawn from her colleagues, afraid that even a whisper of complaint would brand her as difficult or ungrateful. Now, she realized that the same chill that had descended on her had touched others too, though perhaps in gentler, less direct ways. She started by offering help to those who seemed frazzled, a spreadsheet rechecked, a client call covered when someone else needed a break. She made a conscious effort to join quick hallway conversations and to ask after teammates' weekends, listening for clues about who might understand her predicament. In time, small alliances began to form. One afternoon, Karen, from HR, let slip that Lan often ran her team through the ringer, but complaints never seemed to make it to the right ears. Later, Alex, a junior analyst, muttered, "You deserve better, you know," as he handed her a thick folder before a meeting. Lynn didn't press them for details, careful not to spook anyone or risk discovery. Instead, she built trust layer by layer, lending a sympathetic ear, sharing her own stories in careful doses. Where before, Lynn had only endured, now she listened, learned, and reserved judgments. She began to understand how Lan operated. A complex web of pressure, charm, and intimidation that ensnared anyone too honest or too new to resist. Mastering the game. With her foundation of evidence and a nucleus of silent supporters, Lynn turned her attention to mastering the subtleties of office strategy. She studied company policy documents, learning about whistleblower protections and the official complaints process. In the past, she might have ignored such bureaucratic details. Now, she scoured them for loopholes and protections she could leverage. Her evenings were spent researching employees' rights in New York, reading articles and testimonials about others who had exposed unfairness or abuse in the workplace. She took careful notes, saving relevant contact details for law firms and support networks, making sure she would not be blindsided by legalese or technicalities if things escalated. Trusting her instincts, Lynn didn't rush. She knew from watching Lan that a single misstep, a careless word, a misplaced email, could turn the tables against her all over again. She practiced her arguments in the mirror, visualizing the moment she would one day force the truth into the open. The catalyst. Ironically, the next big shift came not from an attack, but from witnessing Lan target someone else. A new recruit, eager and still trusting, fell victim to one of Lan's public dressing downs. The shame on the young woman's face was unmistakable. Lynn watched as her immediate coworkers exchanged the same resigned, fearful glances they had given Lynn only weeks before. That day, Lynn resolved to widen her net, taking the risk to quietly reassure the new colleague. If you ever need advice, don't hesitate to ask. The floodgates opened. Within a week, 3 more coworkers had quietly approached Lynn to share their own stories, some minor, some distressingly similar to her own. What Lynn realized in those candlelit, hushed conversations was simple and profound. She was not alone. What had happened to her was not unique. The office culture had normalized a level of manipulation and scapegoating that left true talent suffocating under fear, planting the seeds of change. By the end of the month, Lynn's collection of evidence had grown sizable, and her sense of isolation had shrunk. She was careful, of course. She trusted only those who had shown integrity and kept their silence, and she never left a trail that might lead back to her prematurely. But there was a newfound energy in the way she walked the halls, a quiet confidence that radiated beneath her calm facade. While Lon continued to operate with an air of invincibility, Lynn no longer cowered. Every snide comment became another data point. Every unreasonable deadline fortified her case. The control Lon thought she wielded was quietly slipping. And most importantly, Lynn was no longer resigned to being a victim. She had moved past survival and into resistance. It was only a matter of time, she believed, before the weight of the truth tipped the balance in her favor. Until then, she would wait, she would watch, and above all, she would not be silent again. A defining turn. The relentless grind of corporate life at Aurora Realty had molded Lynn into someone both resilient and cautious. But the events of recent weeks had awakened a new side of her. A version forged by adversity, intentional in her actions, and willing to pursue justice with the same quiet tenacity she had once poured into her daily work. While her earlier efforts had focused on protecting herself and quietly building alliances, Lynn knew that the next phase demanded something bolder, something irreversible, seeking counsel, facing fear with facts. The idea of legal action had simmered in Lynn's mind for days, surfacing at anxious 3 a.m. intervals and flickering in her thoughts as she scanned policy manuals in the break room. At first, the notion felt almost dangerous, like she was betraying her heritage of humility or drawing fire onto herself instead of simply weathering the storm. But as every day passed and Lon's manipulations grew bolder, Lynn recognized the cost of further silence. On a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, she scheduled a consultation with a local attorney, specializing in workplace harassment and wrongful credit appropriation. It was the first time in years she'd left the office before sunset, heart pounding as she navigated the puddle-splattered sidewalks of Lower Manhattan. The law office itself was snug and welcoming, lined with shelves of legal texts. The attorney, Ms. Patel, listened intently as Lynn recounted her ordeal, responding with a balanced mix of empathy and pragmatism. "You've taken smart steps already, collecting documentation, keeping records, gathering corroboration," Ms. Patel said, clicking through digital folders on Lynn's encrypted USB drive. "What you've described fits a troubling but all too common pattern. If you want to move forward, you need an airtight story. Dates, corroborations, a clear bridge between your contributions and the credit that was publicly diverted. And remember, the goal isn't vengeance. It's accountability and safety." They reviewed state whistleblower protections, anti-retaliation statutes, and what would constitute retaliation or wrongful termination. Ms. Patel outlined the difference between internal company channels, HR complaints, board review, peer witness statements, and escalation paths involving external oversight or litigation. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. By the end, Lynn's initial anxiety had hardened into something firmer, not hope, but a sense of direction. She left with a list of recommendations: what to document next, how to approach potential witnesses, when and how to file a formal complaint internally. A plan begins. calculated preparation. Lynn returned home that night feeling both lighter and more heavily burdened. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what exposure might actually look like. Not just the explosive confrontation she'd fantasized about during long, sleepless nights, but the careful step-by-step that real change required. She thought through every angle. Who would stand by her? Who might turn away, or worse, actively protect Lon? Which pieces of evidence, emails, timestamps, versioned drafts, would best survive rigorous scrutiny? Her evenings grew structured and ritualistic. She built timelines, cross-checked manager meeting notes, and studied paid time-off logs to corroborate her physical presence and contributions during critical moments. She mapped out the arc of escalation. First attempt a direct approach with HR, then, if ignored, gather allies for formal group testimony. She exported key emails to a cloud account created solely for this purpose, printed duplicates, and securely stored backups off-site. Anticipating the emotional cost of exposure, she rehearsed her case, scripting out the vulnerable truths she would have to share about lost trust, loneliness, and the humiliation that had followed her home at night. She imagined voices of dissent, anticipated skepticism, and gave herself permission to answer calmly, even in the face of doubt. Above all, she resolved not to let anger cloud her story. She was not seeking revenge. She was demanding honesty. Building bridges, allies, and advocacy. As Lynn refined her plan, she also paid closer attention to those around her. The culture of fear that Lan had sown through the department remained, but Lynn recognized flickers of support in unexpected places. A junior finance associate who quietly slipped a relevant report onto her desk, or the IT tech who helped restore a lost email thread without asking questions. Lynn began holding quiet after-work conversations in coffee shops, sounding out potential allies, never revealing her full hand, but slowly weaving a net of mutual trust. One evening, as the city hummed beneath neon lights, Lynn met with Karen from HR in a little cafe far from the office, both women glancing over their shoulders before settling into a booth. "I want to ask a hypothetical," Lynn began, careful to keep her tone neutral. "What would happen if a manager's misconduct went unaddressed, even after internal complaints?" Karen hesitated before answering, her hands fidgeting with a ceramic mug. "At some point, the board would have to intervene, but let's just say political considerations sometimes get in the way. Document everything, Lynn. Cover your bases." These measured, cautious conversations helped reinforce Lynn's sense that she was no longer alone in her struggle. At the same time, she realized that courage wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about persistence, preparation, and cooperating with others who sought a healthier workplace. Emotional reckoning, choosing her moment. Lynn still confronted anxiety each morning as she rode the elevator past reflective glass walls, knowing how easily her plan could fall apart under pressure. But there was an undercurrent of energy in her now. A willingness to speak, finally, with her full voice, regardless of the risk. Late at night, Lynn would sit by her window overlooking the city, the lights far below, flickering like possibilities. She revisited the journey that had brought her to this crossroads. Childhood stories of resilience, the sacrifices made to build a life in America, the bittersweet pride in having made it so far. She refused to let these years become a cautionary tale about letting others decide her fate. She marked a date on her calendar, her own deadline to submit her formal complaint and deliver her evidence to the company's upper management. From that point, she would let the process unfold, trusting in her preparation and the integrity she hoped still existed within Aurora Realty's executive ranks. A quiet resolve and clear purpose. In the days leading up to her planned disclosure, Lynn felt herself transforming. She focused on her work not out of compulsion, but as a statement of her own dignity. She checked and double-checked her files. She encouraged colleagues who seemed exhausted, reminding them of their strengths. She no longer let Lan's presence cast a chill over her. Instead, she saw her former friend as a product of a broken culture, one Lynn was finally ready to challenge. By the final night, all her pieces were in place. Lynn felt a pulse of fear, but it no longer controlled her. She was as ready as she would ever be. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling, if not calm, then at least whole. Tomorrow, Lynn would take her story out of the shadows and into the light. And whatever happened next, it would be on her terms. The revelation of truth. The morning of Lynn's confrontation dawned gray and muted, with an early drizzle misting the city's glass towers. To the world, it was just another routine day in Midtown Manhattan. The city's pulse undiminished by the quiet reckoning that was about to unfold several stories above the humming streets. For Lynn, it felt like an unspoken threshold. She stood by her apartment window with a mug of tea warming her palms, gaze unfocused on the blurry skyline. She had rehearsed this day's conversation until the words were memorized, not simply as self-defense but as an act of reclaiming her story. She remembered every humiliation, every silent dismissal, every stolen credit, every late night spent justifying her place at Aurora Realty. Now, whether her gamble would end with vindication or catastrophe, her truth would finally be heard. She left earlier than usual, passing through the city's swirling morning crowds. Her resolve was steel beneath her calm. Her bag weighted with carefully tabbed evidence, printouts of emails, annotated project files, notes chronicling months of manipulation and suppression. Each artifact had been vetted, correlated, and confirmed. Aurora's corporate headquarters was already buzzing when Lynn arrived. The lobby was bright and polished, shiny marble floors gleaming under fluorescent light. She walked its length with practiced poise, offering quiet greetings as usual, yet to herself, each step was measured, each moment freighted with significance. The executive meeting was scheduled for 9. Lynn had requested a formal audience with the board and HR, framing it as a matter critical to the company's values and operations. Procedures obliged them to grant her 30 minutes, but whether she would be truly heard was anyone's guess. She took the elevator to the uppermost floor. The corridor outside the conference room was hushed, carpeted in corporate blue. She could feel a cool draft of apprehension radiating from within herself, but she focused on the rhythm of her steps. When the assistant ushered her in, she nodded politely, then took her seat at one end of the gleaming table. Around her, the highest echelons of Aurora Realty assembled. The CEO, 3 board members, senior HR representatives, and, slightly apart, with perfect composure, Lon. Their eyes flicked over Lynn, polite and expectant, with the guarded chill of those bracing for trouble, but determined not to let it show. The meeting began with formalities. Then, the floor was Lynn's. For a moment, the room seemed to contract onto her alone, every word carrying more weight than she'd ever spoken within these walls. Lynn breathed in, letting the silence settle. When she spoke, her voice was steady, a low ripple carrying years of withheld truths. I am here today because the patterns we accept, the line we draw between ethical and unethical, impacts all of us. Over the past several months, I've experienced and documented serious misconduct with direct consequences for both the company and myself. I am presenting these concerns not for personal retribution, but for the sake of integrity. Yours, mine, and Aurora's collective reputation. She began methodically, stacking evidence like bricks. She provided dates, emails, side-by-side versions of strategy documents, her work, and the versions presented under Lan's name. She included timestamps, collaborative edits, meeting notes, and relevant client correspondence that demonstrated her role as the primary author and architect of critical projects. Every claim was tied to hard evidence. Unlike an emotional accusation, Lynn's testimony was careful and restrained. She made it impossible to dismiss her as merely aggrieved or insubordinate. At points, she referenced company policy, drawing clear connections between official values and the specific breaches she endured. Midway through her explanation, she submitted a detailed timeline to the chairman, who began to study it with furrowed concentration. HR took notes with increasing urgency. The board members, some skeptical at first, grew silent as the mosaic took shape. Months of Lynn's labor repackaged, her contributions methodically erased, repeated instances of her work being attributed up the chain. Throughout, Lynn never raised her voice, but she did not falter. She described the retaliation she'd faced. Punitive, assignments, dismissal of her input, and the systematic isolation and scapegoating that followed her refusal to quietly endure. It was Lan's reaction, however, that most visibly transformed the room. At the first mention of her name, Lan's composure flickered. She straightened, glancing around the table as if weighing her leverage. At first, she attempted to interject, her voice preternaturally calm. "With all due respect, Lynn, teamwork means everyone contributes." Lynn did not look at her. "With all due respect, it is not teamwork if only some people are acknowledged, or if credit is diverted through power rather than merit. Every file and timestamp supports my role, as do certain colleagues' corroboration, documented in these witness statements." The room crackled with tension. There were furtive glances, a subtle shift of posture among the board and HR. Lan started to rebut once more, but this time the CEO raised a hand. "Let her finish." Lynn continued, presenting supporting statements from two colleagues and excerpts of internal messages, revealing unambiguous instances where Lan accepted praise for her work or strategically excluded Lynn from critical communications. 30 minutes passed, then 45. Nobody stopped her. Even those who had seemed dismissive at the outset were now thoroughly absorbed. By the time Lynn concluded, there was a silent gravity to the space, an awareness that something fundamental had been unveiled, far beyond office politics. HR called for a break, signaling deliberation behind closed doors. Lynn was excused while the board reviewed the portfolio she left behind. As she stepped into the corridor, her hands trembled imperceptibly. Not with fear, but with the immeasurable relief of finally standing her ground. She sat by a sun-drenched window and exhaled. Through the glass, the city seemed different now. Not a fortress of indifference, but a living place where truth, however hard-won, could briefly matter. She messaged her support circle, expressing quiet gratitude and exhaustion. From a distance, colleagues whispered and wondered. The woman they'd half-glimpsed in the office shadows was at the center of a rapidly unraveling storm. Inside, the board pored over her files. Some reacted with disbelief. Others with the creeping recognition that this was not a simple dispute, but something systemic and dangerous to the organization's soul. HR compiled questions, and the CEO convened an immediate review of management structures and complaint procedures. When Lynn was called back for follow-up, the mood had shifted palpably. The board thanked her for her courage and transparency. Questions ensued, probing but no longer dismissive. Lan, meanwhile, was visibly unsettled, her usual control a shade too brittle. She offered vague denials and blamed miscommunication, but the evidence was overwhelming, and for perhaps the first time, her authority seemed paper-thin. As Lynn left the meeting that day, the company was already abuzz with rumor and unease. Senior leadership called an emergency session. HR began an internal audit. Several colleagues stopped Lynn in the hallway to offer awkward but heartfelt nods of respect. Standing in the elevator as the doors slid closed, Lynn pressed her hand to her chest, steadying the percussion of nerves and unexpected hope within. She did not know whether victory or sacrifice lay ahead. What mattered, finally, was that her story would not be buried in silence, and that the moment of truth she had fought for belonged to her alone. Change and consequences. The days following Lynn's revelation were anything but ordinary at Aurora Realty. For the first time in years, the veneer of corporate invincibility cracked, and the office, usually so tightly wound, so practiced in the art of silence, buzzed with nervous anticipation. Over the weekend, whispers turned into quiet conversations in hallways, and by Monday morning, the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, investigations, and shifting dynamics. The board acted swiftly in response to Lynn's evidence. An internal audit was launched, spearheaded by HR and 2 external consultants. Every file Lynn had provided was meticulously reviewed, cross-referenced with digital records, and corroborated with witness interviews. The consultants conducted confidential meetings not only with Lynn, but with others who, inspired by her courage, stepped forward to share their own experiences. Lan, for her part, was suspended pending the investigation. Her office, once an intimidating citadel, now stood empty and cold, a silent testament to how quickly power could vanish. Officially, the company's leadership declared the measure temporary, but everyone understood the gravity of the situation. Gone was the air of untouchable authority Lon once wielded. In its place was an atmosphere weighted with both relief and anxiety. For Lynn, returning to work during the investigation was surreal. Some colleagues glanced at her with newfound respect, a few with uncomfortable curiosity, and others with relief. Relief that someone had finally put voice to what many had silently endured. The walls Lon had built seemed to dissolve overnight. The coffee break rooms grew lively again. Candid conversations blossomed amid uncertainty. People began reaching out to Lynn discreetly. A thank you whispered at the elevator, an affirming email sliding quietly into her inbox. Personal reckoning and lingering doubt. Amidst these outward changes, Lynn herself was unsettled. Though externally composed, she moved through her days in a fog of conflicting emotions. Vindication warred with sadness, pride with exhaustion, and the ache of old wounds pulsed beneath every encouraging remark. At times, it was hard to know what felt more powerful: the relief of being heard or the cost of everything it had taken to reach that point. Nights were restless, haunted by replayed memories of each humiliation and sleepless with worries about what came next. She often pondered, would her victory last? Could the company truly change, or was this merely damage control? The outpouring of support from colleagues warmed her, but it also triggered the ache of friendships lost and the bitterness of unrealized dreams. Her relationship with Lon occupied her thoughts more than she wanted to admit. Once, they had been inseparable, laughing over takeout in empty conference rooms and dreaming about futures bigger than either had dared imagine alone. Now, all that remained was a jagged silence. Lynn could not decide if she hoped Lon would reach out in apology or whether closure would come only through distance. The cost to Lan and to the old order. Lan's downfall sent ripples through the management ranks. Over the years, she had cultivated both loyalists and silent critics. Now, even those who had benefited from her ambition kept their distance. Some whispered that Lan had always walked too close to the line. Others struggled between private sympathy and public pragmatism, worried about what their own complicity meant. For Lan herself, the reality of suspension stung sharply. She was instructed to stay away from the office and relinquish company devices while the investigation proceeded. Days later, a terse message from her private email reached Lynn, a mixture of bitterness and a faint belated apology. I never meant for it to come to this. I underestimated you. Maybe I did myself too. Lynn read it several times before quietly deleting the note, feeling no satisfaction, only a strange, hollow sadness. Leadership's response. A pledge to change. Aurora Realty's leadership faced its own reckoning. After years of trumpeting integrity and vision, the board's failure to notice systemic issues was a stain not easily erased. The CEO called an all-staff meeting. For once, there was no corporate jargon. "We failed to protect our values. We failed our people." He announced mandatory management training, a new framework for reporting workplace concerns, and a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation. HR launched workshops and listening sessions, first small and awkward, but gradually growing more candid as staff tested whether this new openness was genuine. Some were skeptical, others quietly hopeful. As policies evolved, so too did relationships between staff and managers. People began to trust that their concerns might be heard. A more open culture and lingering scars. In the weeks that followed, the company's atmosphere lightened in subtle, unmistakable ways. There were more straightforward conversations, more laughter, and, most tellingly, more recognition for hard work that might previously have gone unnoticed. Lynn's role evolved as well. While she kept her trademark low profile, it was impossible now for leadership to ignore her skills and strength under pressure. Yet, healing was incomplete, both for Lynn and the office at large. Not all wounds faded quickly. Some colleagues left for new opportunities, unable to reconcile with the past. Others struggled to adapt to a changed landscape, uncertain how to rebuild trust within an organization that had tolerated injustice for so long. As for Lynn, she received an official statement of apology from the board. It was public, formal, and carefully worded, but what mattered most was how it served as an affirmation. Her perseverance had not been in vain. She was offered a position on a new initiatives team tasked with improving workplace transparency and mentorship, a challenge she accepted, determined to turn her ordeal into something meaningful. Bittersweet closure and growth. There was no triumphant parade, no dramatic final confrontation. The resolution of Lynn's case came quietly. She was officially dismissed, with a muted press release citing breach of company values. Some saw this as just, others as tragic. Lynn herself felt only a somber closure, a recognition that justice carries a price, not just for the guilty, but for everyone touched along the way. Gradually, Lynn allowed herself to hope again. She reconnected with friends outside work, answered her parents' calls, and found small joys in city walks and sunny afternoons. The lessons of the year remained, not as scars to hide, but as reminders of her own resilience. At Aurora Realty, the legacy of her courage endured. A noticeable shift in how people treated one another, how leaders listened, and how silent contributions found their voice. Even in moments when Lynn doubted herself, she could look around the office and see the difference. Honesty no longer banished, but invited. Fairness, not just spoken, but practiced. In this new landscape, hard-won, imperfect, but true, Lynn discovered that sometimes change comes not with celebration, but with the quiet, persistent work of healing. And in that, she found both the cost and the enduring gift of her stand for justice. Justice and renewal. The aftermath of Aurora Realty's reckoning was more profound than any quick victory. Justice called for more than the removal of a toxic leader or the rewriting of policies. It meant a recalibration of what the company stood for, and, for Lynn, a deep reimagining of her own place in the world. A public acknowledgement. A week after Lynn's quiet dismissal, the board convened a rare all-hands meeting. The tone was reverent, almost somber. Employees filtered into the main conference hall with a mix of anticipation and caution, many still processing the unprecedented turmoil of recent weeks. In the front row, Lynn sat with hands folded, doing her best to appear composed. though a flutter of nerves brewed beneath the surface. The CEO took the stage, flanked by the company's leadership. There was no attempt to deflect or dilute the message. We gather here to address failures of integrity within Aurora Realty and to acknowledge the courage of an employee whose honesty has set us on the path to healing, he said, glancing directly at Lynn. What followed was a formal apology, not only for the injustice Lynn endured, but for an office culture that had made such silence possible. The board recounted her unacknowledged contributions and cited examples of her leadership, tenacity, and professionalism, qualities that had gone unrecognized, but which now illuminated a new standard for the company. I was wrong to think I was invisible, Lynn later recalled to a friend. The only thing invisible was the truth, until someone finally saw it. Restoration and a new role. The conclusion of the meeting brought a new beginning. The board publicly invited Lynn to accept a senior position on Aurora's Diversity and Ethics Committee, a role designed not as a consolation prize, but as a true seat at the table. For Lynn, the offer was both a vindication and a daunting responsibility. She took time to reflect before answering, looking carefully at what meant most to her. Accepting the position, she made a quiet promise to herself, never to confuse silence with peace, and never to allow another voice to be lost in the machinery of ambition. Her new responsibilities included mentoring young employees, revising workplace policies, and leading task forces on equity and transparency. Day by day, Lynn learned to speak not just for herself, but for those still learning to raise their voices. Lan's bittersweet reckoning. Meanwhile, the aftermath for Lan unfolded away from public view. Once lauded for brilliance and leadership, she now found herself on the margins, her reputation untouchable in an industry that had built her up only to turn away in scandal. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unsure how to process gossip from sympathy. In the solitude that followed, Lan confronted the complex tangle of her ambition, insecurity, and regret. She issued an apology to Lynn, not through a company channel, but in a handwritten letter left at Lynn's door. The words were clumsy and raw. I mistook survival for success, and I wounded both of us. I hope one day you find it in your heart to forgive me and to know that your strength forced me to face myself. Lynn read the letter in silence, tears blurring the page. She did not answer, understanding that forgiveness is sometimes a process, not a decision. A quiet but changed workplace. The transformation at Aurora Realty was no fairy tale, but it was real. The culture Lynn once described as chilly corridors full of shadows, warmed by degrees. Managers were held to new standards, and some were replaced, while employees were encouraged, for the first time, to tell their own stories without fear of retaliation. Lynn's presence in meetings became a symbol, not only of justice achieved, but of what was possible when courage found its voice. She watched as colleagues who had long stayed silent began to speak up, pushing for better systems, demanding recognition for overlooked labor, and standing guardian for those still uncertain. The progress was slow and flawed, but it was genuine. She found herself unexpectedly busy, juggling new projects with the patience and precision that had once been her burden, now her asset. She hosted workshops on workplace dignity and led lunch and learn gatherings where junior staff could share their experiences. No longer cut off from her peers, Lynn discovered joy in connection. Laughter over coffee, honest conversation, a sense of shared mission, healing and personal renewal. Outside of work, Lynn pursued her healing just as determinedly. She returned to the long walks she loved, the city's seasons now feeling less threatening, more like possibility. She found comfort in friendship again, reconnecting with old acquaintances, finally replying to patient messages from overseas family. It was not always easy. Some nights, shadows crept in, the memory of humiliation, the fear that all she'd built might still be fragile. But each morning, she reminded herself that growth often comes disguised as hardship, and that recovery is not forgetting, but integrating the lessons of pain. At home, Lynn began journaling for the first time since her arrival in New York. Her entries chronicled not only her workplace journey, but her personal revelations, her resilience, her ability to forgive, her evolving sense of self-worth. A broadening impact. As Aurora's new culture solidified, other companies in the industry took notice. Lynn was invited to speak at panels about integrity and corporate healing. She received requests to consult for firms grappling with their own internal reckonings. Each time, she answered honestly, "There's no one solution, only the persistence to keep asking hard questions and the humility to listen." Despite these new opportunities, Lynn never let go of her connection to the quiet strivers whose stories mirrored her own. She used her influence to champion their advancement, reviewing promotion lists and advocating for transparent recruitment. A brand new hope. In those moments when Lynn wandered Aurora's halls, she no longer wondered if her presence mattered. She saw it, felt it in the nod of respect from a colleague or the tentative knock on her open office door. She was no longer the silent woman in the corner cubicle. She had become a movement, proof that justice is less a single victory than a continuum, renewed each time someone finds the courage to stand tall. The lesson that remained was quietly profound. Justice changes not only a workplace, but the people who fight for it. And renewal is not a return to the past, but an embrace of new strength forged through struggle. On a bright Friday evening, as Lynn locked up her office and stepped into the gentle glow of the city lights, she allowed herself a deep, contented sigh. In every sense that mattered, she had not only survived the crucible, she had been transformed by it. And as she moved forward, she carried the promise of justice and renewal, both for herself and for those who would follow. Looking toward the future months had passed since Lynn first raised her voice against injustice at Aurora Realty. What began as a struggle for recognition and dignity had unfolded into a profound metamorphosis, within Lynn, within her colleagues, and within the company itself. But change, as Lynn was learning, was not a destination. It was a direction. The journey ahead, full of uncertainties, now felt more like possibility than threat. Redefining her strength. At first, the days after her exoneration felt strangely quiet. The storms had passed, but Lynn felt the aftershocks in unexpected ways, the careful glances from new colleagues, the lingering respect in email threads, the way her ideas were now sought out rather than ignored. There was satisfaction in this, yes, but also a need to redefine what strength meant for her. No longer content with merely surviving or quietly excelling, Lynn began to focus on thriving. She set aside time for self-reflection, returning each weekend to her journal to make sense of the whirlwind. What had helped her persevere? What kind of leader did she want to become? She recognized that self-protection was important, but so was openness, to new risks, to new sources of joy, and even to vulnerability. In the past, Lynn had believed that blending in was the safest way to succeed in America. Now she saw the power and even the obligation of standing out when necessary. She started practicing small, everyday acts of courage, speaking up at meetings, negotiating her project terms openly, and supporting others who were steeling themselves to speak out. Mentorship and paying it forward. Lynn's promotion to the Diversity and Ethics Committee gave her a seat at the table, but she quickly realized that the real work of transformation happened in private conversations and mentoring moments. She made herself available to younger employees, hosting open lunch hours, offering tips for navigating office politics, and sharing her own hard-won lessons in confidence and caution. One afternoon, a young woman named Trang approached her hesitantly in the break room. How did you know when the time was right to speak up? Trang asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lynn smiled, remembering her own suppressed questions when she arrived in New York. I didn't know, she replied honestly. But I realized that the pain of saying nothing had finally grown heavier than the risk of telling the truth. If you're waiting for courage to arrive before you act, you'll wait forever. Sometimes, courage comes only after you've already begun. These moments of connection sustained Lynn. She wrote reference letters highlighting diverse talents, advocated for policy changes that offered real protections, and never forgot the isolation she had once felt. She quietly ensured that no talented worker at Aurora would feel as invisible or unsupported as she once did. Shaping an intentional career. With her professional reputation restored and her confidence rebuilt, Lynn took time to reassess her aspirations. Was corporate life her calling, or was there something broader she might pursue? Invitations began to arrive. Industry forums on business ethics, alumni circles asking her to speak, even city networking groups interested in her story. Lynn accepted a handful of opportunities, careful not to overextend herself. At each event, she chose honesty and humility over perfection, acknowledging that her journey was ongoing. In panel discussions, she highlighted the messiness of real change, that companies could enforce policies and run workshops, but that true respect and fairness came from people holding themselves and each other accountable. Outside Aurora, Lynn began writing essays about her experiences as a woman of color and an immigrant navigating the American business ecosystem. These essays, sometimes raw and always candid, found a small but loyal audience of professionals who saw their own struggles reflected in her words. Personal healing and horizons. Professionally, Lynn was thriving. Privately, the path to healing remained complex but hopeful. She rekindled close friendships that had withered during her hardest times and welcomed her parents for their first visit since she moved abroad. Together, they walked along the city's avenues, her mother marveling at the skyscrapers, her father reminding Lynn to get enough rest. Gradually, Lynn allowed herself small pleasures again: late afternoon walks in Central Park, spontaneous dinners with friends, quiet evenings lost in novels. She realized she was no longer waiting for disaster, nor defining herself by the wounds others had left. Forgiveness for Lan came slowly. Lynn reread Lan's letter until she could do so without resentment, choosing to release, not forget, the past. She knew healing was a process, and that some scars would remain, but she was determined to let them be a testament to how far she had come. The next generation and the ripple effect. With the culture at Aurora Realty opening up, Lynn saw the next generation of professionals start to take bolder steps. New hires asked about whistleblower processes during orientation. A team of interns developed a code of conduct project, inspired in part by Lynn's story. One junior manager, once terrified of making waves, now guided her team with patience and transparency. The ripple effect extended outward. Aurora received inquiries from industry peers seeking guidance on policy reform and ethical leadership. Lynn contributed her voice but always credited the collective work of those who had stepped forward. Her allies, her mentors, and even those whose dissent had fueled her determination. She also took time to remember those who had left, colleagues whose pain had not found resolution, but whose quiet contributions had paved the way for change. Lynn kept a notebook of their stories, private but honored, reminding herself that not every victory is public, and not every triumph feels complete. A lasting message of courage. As Lynn looked to her own future, she wondered how best to sum up the past year. She drafted a letter, never sent, but saved as a promise to herself and a legacy for those she might one day mentor. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to leave silence behind. Justice is not a final score, but a daily commitment. Let us choose to see one another fully, speak for those who cannot yet speak for themselves, and measure success not only by what we achieve, but by how we lift others along the way. The days ahead would bring new challenges, Lynn knew, but no longer did she feel unanchored or alone. In her story, its struggles, its lessons, and its victories, she found both closure and a path forward. Looking toward the light. On the eve of her first work anniversary since everything changed, Lynn stood by her office window, watching the city bring itself alive in lights. In the glowing reflection, she saw not only herself, but all those whose lives she had touched and been touched by in return. "No matter what comes next," Lynn whispered, "I will not disappear again." And with that, she closed her laptop, gathered her things, and stepped out, toward the future, toward hope, and toward the promise of new beginnings.